and welcome to BizRun. This video is the 7th video in a series called Leave and Time Off Management, where we will give you an in-depth view of the module and instruction in BizRun. We encourage you to watch all the videos in order, then go back to rewatch and use as reference the videos that apply to your organization. Up to this point in the instructional video series, we've shown you how to set up time off holidays, enable time off types, and set up any scheduled rollover or lump sum allotment of hours. We introduced you to time off accruals, what they are, the different types, and how they're used and applied to the time off types. We also demonstrated and talked about some helpful information provided by BizRun when running different reports, like the time and attendance report, the payroll report, and the time off balance report. These reports provide information that can help you and your people make important decisions and manage leave and time off in BizRun. In this particular video, we're going to spend some time in the Personal Info Time Off Accrual tab for you to gain a solid understanding of the different accrual entries that may have been added by BizRun's support team during implementation, how to read or interpret these entries, and how they relate to specific or other typical PTO policies that organizations use. We'll also go over what entries to expect when your annual rollover or allotment policy kicks in, if applicable, and how those appear as accrual entries in the Time Off Accrual tab. So let's start by going to a person's Personal Info Time Off Accrual tab. Let's choose Michaela as the example. As soon as you select the tab, the most recent time off accrual entries will display. To get a broader display, let's select a start date in the past and an end date out into the future. Then click the filter button. Once the display refreshes, you'll notice that the accrual entries are listed in reverse chronological order and with varying time off and accrual types. The best way to understand and read this list is from the bottom up. We recommend reading the entries by time off type, then by accrual type, and finally by hours. For instance, for vacation, Michaela has a 0-hour balance entry effective January 1st, 2017. This is her starting point, or starting balance. If we read up the list, we'll notice another January 1st entry for vacation, but this one is for the accrual type rate of 200 hours per year. The next entry up is dated January 1st, 2018, again with a 0-hour balance. If we keep reading up, we see that every January 1st, her balance starts off at 0 hours, or nothing. So, with these entries, we can interpret the PTO policy as having a use it or lose it clause for vacation. Not only does she start off with nothing on the 1st of January every year, but she also earns vacation time at a rate of 200 hours per year, or about a half an hour every day. If we do the same for the sick and illness time off type, we'll notice the same use it or lose it clause as vacation, but with a different rate of 64 hours per year. Note, the use it or lose it or 0 rollover max hours are automatically added into Michaela's Time Off Accrual tab as balance entries every year on January 1st. This is executed and based on a time off type settings for sick, illness, and vacation. Now, let's read the floating holiday accrual entries. Again, reading from the bottom up, Michaela's first entry for floating holiday is dated January 1st, 2017 with a balance or starting balance of 16 hours. If we read up the list, we'll see a January 1st floating holiday entry for the following year, 2018. But this one is with the accrual type adjustment and is for 16 hours. The next entry up is also dated January 1st, 2018, but this one is for 0 hours for the accrual type balance. If we keep reading up, we see that every January 1st, her balance starts off at 0 or nothing, and she has an accompanying adjustment entry for 16 hours. So with these entries, we can interpret the PTO policy as having a lump sum or annual allotment clause, as well as a use it or lose it clause for floating holiday. In other words, rather than earning the hours for floating holiday on a daily basis, like vacation and sick illness, Michaela gets 16 hours as a lump sum every January 1st, but has to use those hours during that year. Any unused hours will be forfeit. This particular setup for floating holiday is a possible alternative to using the time off holidays, as discussed in the first video of this series. If some of your people observe certain holidays throughout the year while others don't, you may want to consider using the floating holidays time off type along with an annual lump sum setting and have everyone explicitly request time off for specific holidays instead. Note, the lump sum hours for floating holiday that are automatically added into Michaela's Time Off Accrual tab are added as adjustment entries, not balance entries, for every year on January 1st. Again, based on the time off type settings for floating holiday. Let's go back to Heather's example in BizRun so we can see and interpret her Time Off Accrual tab entries after a more complex rollover and lump sum event happens. If you recall from our last video about the adjustment accrual type, Heather had multiple adjustment entries on a date, April 5th, 2021. Let's review her paid time off and sick illness time off type settings and day end balances prior so we can get a clear picture of her situation leading up to this event. This is what Heather's time off accrual looked like prior to April 5th. On January 1st, 2021, she had a 22-hour balance entry for paid time off. On the same date, she also had a 23-hour balance entry for sick illness. Heather doesn't have any accrual entries with rate or hours earned per hour worked, so those balances remain the same until she either takes time off or other accrual entries are added. If we continue to read from the bottom up, we see an accrual entry dated January 4th, 2021 for an adjustment of 40 hours for paid time off, assuming she doesn't take time off. And if we run the balance report for April 4th, January 2021, with no other accrual entries in that time period, we find out that Heather's day end balance for sick illness is 23 hours and for paid time off is 62 hours. That's 22 hours she had on January 1st plus the 40 hours given as an adjustment on January 4th. Now, let's take a look at Heather's time off type settings by going back to her Time Off Accrual tab and clicking on the gear next to the Add New button. From here, we'll see that she has personal settings for both paid time off and sick illness. Let's review the settings for sick illness first. The setting shows that every April 5th, any unused hours up to a maximum of 40 hours will be transferred or converted to paid time off hours. Now let's review the settings for paid time off. The first setting is essentially the same setting from sick illness as we just saw. Since it involves paid time off, it is listed here for your convenience and cross-reference so you would know if any other time off types are transferred into this time off type. The second setting shows on every April 5th, there's a 0 rollover max or a use it or lose it clause. But in addition to that, there's also a lump sum adjustment of 20 hours that is executed on that date as well. In other words, any unused paid time off hours are forfeit, but they get replenished with a lump sum of 20 hours on April 5th of every year. So, once this rollover and lump sum event takes place, we can expect multiple adjustment and balance entries with an effective date of April 5th of that year added into Heather's Time Off Accrual tab in order to support her organization's PTO policy. With the event behind us, let's now look at her Time Off Accrual tab. On April 5th, 2021, these are the accrual entries for sick illness. An adjustment entry of 0 hours which follows the 0 lump sum setting, and a balance entry of 0 hours. This follows the use it or lose it and rollover transfer to paid time off setting. On the same date, these are now the accrual entries for paid time off. An adjustment entry of 23 hours, which follows the rollover transfer from the sick illness setting. Remember, prior to April 5th, Heather had a 23-hour balance of sick illness. Those hours have now been converted to paid time off hours. An adjustment entry of 20 hours was also added. This follows the lump sum setting. You'll see another adjustment entry added, but this 10-hour entry was actually added manually by an administrator. And finally, you'll see a 0-hour balance entry, and this follows the rollover max setting. Remember, prior to April 5th, Heather had a 62-hour calculated balance of paid time off. Those unused hours were forfeit on April 5th. Now, let's run a balance report for April 5th, and you'll see that her day end balance for paid time off is calculated to be 53 hours. That's 23 hours from the rollover transfer, plus 20 hours from the lump sum, plus the 10 hours from the manual adjustment by the administrator. With the exception of the manual entry, all the April 5th entries were added automatically by BizRun in order to follow or execute the rollover and lump sum policy per the time off type settings. So, doing the following will help you better understand the calculations that BizRun does for a person's time off balance. Read the Accrual tab entries from the bottom up. Check the time off type settings, whether or not a person has an exception or personal setting, or if they simply follow global settings, if there are any. And broaden the date range to get the big picture. Let's look at one last person's Time Off Accrual tab to show what it means to broaden the date range and to get the big picture. Let's go to Nancy's Time Off Accrual tab. If you recall from the video about the hours earned per hour worked accrual type, Nancy was earning paid time off with a factor of 0.039, which is equivalent to 80 hours per year. When her Time Off Accrual tab is accessed by either herself, a system, or time and attendance administrator, it will display the most recent entries. Again, to get a broader display of the accrual entries, let's select a start date way in the past and an end date even further out in the future than default. Then click the filter button. While the default display of the most recent entries is designed for your convenience, we highly recommend you broaden the date range of the display so you can get the big picture of the person's accrual schedule, especially when troubleshooting or trying to better understand the calculations behind a person's calculated balance. In some cases, a person earning at a certain rate or with a particular factor may have been doing so for a long time. Or their factor could be scheduled to change or increase at some point in time in the future. The entry for either of those may not immediately display when you enter the Time Off Accrual tab. This could happen, perhaps, if it has an effective date way in the past or far out in the distant future. In the case for Nancy, the accrual entries that immediately show when entering the Time Off Accrual tab are for 2021. If we extend the end date to way out in the future, we would see, and only after adjusting the end date and clicking the filter button, that her factor changes to 0.058 on January 1st, 2025. Let's further broaden the display by selecting a start date, way in the past, then clicking the filter button again. So, reading Nancy's entire record in the Time Off Accrual tab will interpret the PTO policy that is used for her is one in which she started earning 0.019 paid time off hours for every hour worked starting January 1st, 2005. Her factor then changes on January 1st, 2021 and will change again in 2025. Then, from that point on, she'll be earning time off with that factor going forward. Without changing the start and end date to broaden the date range, we may not have seen the big picture for Nancy. So doing so is always a good idea. And that's how you read and understand the accrual entries like a pro in the Personal Info Time Off Accrual tab in BizRun. Be sure to check out our next video in the Leave and Time Off Management instructional series, where we will take an even deeper dive into the Personal Info Time Off Accrual tab and show you how to add entries on your own, and even discuss options that you can consider adding to your accrual entries that may enhance your organization's leave and time off policy and needs. Hope this helps. Thank you for watching.